So I think the question that's been in the back of my mind throughout the weekend really is what we're doing here, or what are we doing here, or what are we doing here, or what are we doing here? So, I mean, the most obvious question to that is that we're learning about the future, and we've learned about waves and transitions and phases, and we've learned that the future is getting ever smaller into micro, nano, nano, and ever bigger into questions about the cosmos and what have you. And I think I suppose the main thing that I've learned about it is that it's deeply perplexing. And it's deeply perplexing because we create it, and yet we don't understand it. It's our creation, and yet we don't control it. And so we live with a sort of perplexing abundance, or the possibility thereof, a sort of fog of possibilities that are so great that it's very difficult to sort of make sense of. And that abundance that we seem to be on the verge of, the abundance that Eric Drexler talked of nano-atomic precision manufacturing, of all kinds of forms of genetic and synthetic biology and so on and so forth, comes at the same time with a sort of sense of existential threat that our very existence might be at stake as well. And so we operate in a kind of tiny margin between the possibility of real abundance and the possibility of complete extinction. So it's very, very perplexing. And then it's perplexing in the way that Andrew Bloom said it was perplexing, which is all this stuff for us, or are we for it? I mean, is it there to help us, to serve us as tools, or do we find ourselves fitting ourselves into its templates, rhythms, frameworks, and so on and so forth? And so if we leave here and we go into this kind of fog of possibility, what should we use? How should we organize ourselves to guide us? Well, I just want to suggest we've heard 5 kind of tips, really, about what we could do. And the first is really that we should form a kind of faith, that we should leave here and form a church, because this has been a bit like a congregation, and not just because it's been on a Sunday, and not just because when we have these things, we are in a sort of reverential kind of pose in relation to them, sort of almost nodding to our devices. And not just because the Apple Store is a kind of cathedral, and not just because these are a bit like a primitive form of religion because they bring magic into the world, but because actually to believe in innovation, you have to believe in things that don't currently exist. It has to be, in a way, a kind of form of faith. And so when Roberto Unger, in his amazing talk this morning, talked about the creation of a kind of humanity in which all men and women would be their own kind of prophets, a kind of mass democratic disputational religion, in a way that must be right. But I think we'd all be uneasy with the idea of a blind faith or an open faith. So perhaps a religion without God is one component of the future. The second word is knowledge, that there have been times over the last couple of days where through the fog of possibility, a shaft of knowledge has come, and someone has said, I know how to do it, and this is what the future is, and I can hold on to it. And perhaps the most impressive example of that was Eric Drexler, that I heard, I know how to do atomic precision manufacturing. This is how it works. This is what we will be able to do with it. And Pat on stage last night relating the overview that Paul Mason gave of the future of the economy, then said, and I went downstairs and I saw it. There it was, Eric Drexler. And you kind of hold on to that as knowledge. And that reminds me, the person that most reminds me of is my mother-in-law, Iris, who's 84. And Iris has just moved in round the corner from us. And the cognitive overload of moving house from her old house to this flat has left her really confused. And so she keeps on saying, she's said for the last 3 months, I'm really going to get on top of it. I'm going to sort out my wardrobe. I'm going to reorganize my kitchen. And each time she reorganizes something and she fixes it, something else escapes her. and she feels life is confused. And I think that's kind of where we are. We are in a state of self-induced collective mild dementia, because actually the world we're creating is so confusing that any time we think we know a bit of it, the other bits of it escape us. So knowledge, defining things, making them concrete, cause and effect, will get us only a little part of the way, I think, into the future. And the third thing that I've heard people talk about a lot, almost as much as abundance, is normality. We're desperate to know whether we're normal, basically. And so this question of what is abnormal and normal has kind of threaded through lots of discussions. So it was right at the start of our discussions with Bertolt Meyer and his revolving 360-degree hand. And is that normal or not? And well, so someone would say, well, it's normal to wear glasses, so why wouldn't it be normal to have that kind of thing? It's normal to have apps. Why not have an app that controls glasses and then an app that controls hands? That's merely an extension of where we are. It sort of normalizes it. And Ben Hammersley yesterday in a very good talk talked about the power of analogies, that we like to normalize the future by creating analogies with the past, and this entire building is a building of analogies. But I would favor, I think, Anab Jain's position, which is the now is strange, and that actually what we need to do is constantly remind ourselves of how odd, strange, and abnormal things are. Or when Drew Hamnett talked about the Festival of the Future being a place where you could strangify things. Downstairs, the science fiction writers were talking about deliberate cognitive estrangement, to make the world seem strange. In other words, I think we should embrace the abnormal, the extreme, the odd, the unusual, because therein will lie the very different models that we will need in the future. And if we try and normalize things too fast, we will lose their specialness. So I think one approach to the future might be faith, but it's a partial approach. One might be knowledge, but that's a partial approach. And one might be to normalize things and to try and see the future in terms of the past and bring it down to earth. I don't think any of those really will be enough. So I'm drawn back to the fourth approach, which is that if we are all in a fog of possibility, then actually what we need to do is rely upon one another to find our way out. And if we're all the blind leading the blind, and that's essentially our position, the blind leading the blind on the verge of abundance on one side and existential risk on the other. If that's a rough approximation of where we are, then what do we need to do? Well, what I think we need to do is we need to fan out and search and learn from one another. We need to search together and stay linked. We need to use all our possible connections and to, if you like, extend and multiply the kind of number of networks, connections, groups, we's, who we might be. Ben Hammersley yesterday challenged us to imagine what kind of new forms of collective belonging we could imagine that we were part of, trying to chart the future. One very powerful theme of the last 2 days is that we must use all of our senses, not just our heads, not just our feelings, but our touch and what have you. And so our ability to notice and attend to the world in a variety of myriad ways, and not just to think of it in rational or emotional terms, is absolutely vital. I would recommend to you that one of the things that you should learn how to do if you want to chart this future is to learn how to take detours. Whenever the way presents itself that is straight and fast, if you want to go quickly and you know where you're going, that's fine. But if you're unsure of your destination, then I would advise you to take detours, to look sideways, and to follow routes that might be slower but much, much more interesting. So we need to learn how to take detours. And if we live as we seem to do, in an age of oxymorons, where everything productive is, in a sense, a kind of almost sounds impossible, then that has consequences for us too. So if you just think about the world as it's been described to us, it's a world that our chef from the Basque Country talked about techno-emotional food. Paul Mason talked about networks as hierarchies, or the combination of the two. Throughout the 2 days, we've talked about the way the virtual and the physical come together here and there. Ronald Dworkin, in a famous essay towards the end of his life, talked about the need for a religion without God, a kind of atheistic religion. So if we live in a world where opposites will come together, and whatever you have will almost certainly produce an element of what is opposite to it, then you need to live with the possibility of oxymorons, things that don't apparently make sense, and almost you need to live like an oxymoron. So I've been struck over the 2 days by the number of people who seem to have lost their identity. Most powerfully, this was Sonia Tigueres, who's a nanoscientist, talking downstairs. And she was describing how when you broke down silver into its nano ingredients, it changed its character and identity completely, and silver became toxic. And almost as an aside, she said, and I don't know my own identity. I don't know whether I'm a biologist, a nanomaterials scientist, or what have you. And so if we are in this world where we are together trying to fumble in this fog of possibility, then we need what the political philosopher Charles Leadbetter called skillful incompleteness. Being able to know how to cope with situations where we will never have enough information and knowledge to completely understand them, and we'll need to be able to make our way in them in the face of huge uncertainty and great risk. Lindblom said in a famous article in 1959 where he introduced this notion of skillful incompleteness, and Lindblom would be completely at home in this kind of setting. The title of this brilliant paper was called Muddling Through, The Case for Muddling Through. 25 years later, he wrote another paper called Still Muddling, Not Yet Through. And I think actually still muddling and not yet through isn't a bad way to think about where we're headed. But it's not enough. Because I think that sense of collective coping, of searching together, needs to be imbued with a kind of spirit, a spirit of optimism, of hope, of possibility, of humanity. And time and again over the last 2 days, that's come through. And I suppose for me, most powerfully, it came through listening to Alice Taylor last night at the very end of yesterday, with this sort of exuberant, celebratory account of collective creativity and making all around dolls, and of a sort of sense that we're all involved in some giant experiment together in which we must learn from one another. And so when Roberto Unger this morning talked about the need for a high-energy politics, a high-energy democracy, or when Jean Tallinn earlier, talking about Skype, talked about the need for the future to be shaped by people who enjoy life, they were both talking about what Alice Taylor is like, that kind of sense of exuberance and tumult, and of life, and of vibrancy, and of unpredictability. The future must be tumultuous. It cannot be banal and flat-packed. The only thing that I disagreed with, I think, in Roberto Unger's talk was when he said that children are tongue-tied prophets. He doesn't spend enough time with children. Last night, on the way home, I stopped at the HMV store in Islington to get my 13-year-old son what turned out to be the last copy of the Xbox version of GTA 5. As I went to this strange experience being in HMV, it's almost like a sort of thing that shouldn't exist. It seems like a charity shop now, really, HMV. And so I handed over this copy of Grand Theft Auto 5 to the guy on the till, and he said, "You do realize this is a returned copy, it's second-hand?" And I said, "Oh, that's slightly odd, because it's only been out a few days." And he said, no, what happens is that people take time off to play these games when they come out. And once they've played them, within a few days, they return them, and then they get store credit, and then they buy another game. And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And he said, "Well, I only work here on a weekend, but I'm a teacher, and during the week, the children at school all talk about how quickly they've finished the game." So distracted by that, I thought, what on earth is a teacher doing working in HMV on a weekend, selling games that are so interesting that the kids don't go to school because they play them? There's something deeply sort of troubling about all of this. So then I take it home and I give it to my 13-year-old, who plays it and then, comes to sit at the table for dinner. And I said, "Well, what's it like, this game?" And he said, "Well, it's really, really good. And you could, if you wanted to see it in your terms, Dad, think that it was a statement about society." I said, "What statement about society is it making, GTA 5? He said, "The statement about society it's making is that society is a bit of a joke." So I said, "Well, that's really interesting. I've just been at this conference all day where we've been talking about collective possibility and making things. And then, of course, the prospect of 3D computing, making the future, the Makey Lab, being part of that bursting of possibility that Alice Taylor and others was talking about, really connected with him." And that's what we have to connect with. Because the challenges that we face now, that we collectively face, are huge. They're not challenges we've talked about much. We have not talked about water. We haven't talked about energy much. We haven't talked about the need to feed the fast-growing cities of the developing world. These are the places where the future will be made. Actually, it probably won't be made in Shoreditch or in the Googleplex. It will be made in the very fast-growing, poorest cities in the world where the struggle for survival will be intense. And we have to become a society of speculators. We have to become a society where everyone is capable, if you like, of speculating about the future, and as Rachel Armstrong said downstairs, capable of imagining some new way of developing a sustainable basis for human life. That's the challenge. It's huge, and it's also really exciting, because in the next 30 years, if we don't create entirely new ways to produce water, to grow food, to provide energy, to deliver education, to make possible health, to house people, then actually we are in deep trouble. And to avoid deep trouble, we will need creativity on a scale that I don't think we've yet imagined. So to guide us, finally, let me give you two quotes from people that have come to my mind in the course of these 2 days, and which I've researched extensively using my iPhone. And the first, sort of echoing Roberto Ungar's talk about religion, comes from David Foster Wallace, the American writer, who gave a brilliant commencement speech called "This is Water." And to paraphrase Foster Wallace, he said, "If you worship money, you'll never have enough. And if you worship your body and sexual allure, you will always be ugly. If you worship power, you will always be fearful and weak. And if you worship being smart, you're bound to feel stupid. This is the so-called real world. But if you want to be educated is to be able to choose carefully what you attend to. And the real freedom is to choose carefully who you will attend to and to care for them and to be prepared to sacrifice for them. That is a deeper sense of freedom." So that's David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace says, we have a choice about what to worship. Everyone worships something. Choose carefully who and what you worship. And the final quote comes from Ronald Dworkin, the American political philosopher and legal theorist, who put dignity right at the heart of his account of the moral order, right at the end of his life, in a book called Religion Without God. He said, "If we manage to lead the good life, we make our lives like tiny diamonds in the cosmic sands." We are like tiny diamonds in the cosmic sands if we choose to live our lives in a way that attends to others. Stick together. Thank you.